A judge sentenced a criminal, then discovered he was his own son. When Judge William Harrington delivers a harsh sentence, then Teresa, the woman he abandoned, forces him to face the truth. The young man he condemned is his own flesh and blood. As doubt creeps into Harrington's once unshakable certainty, his world begins to crack. But is it too late to undo the damage? Or has he already destroyed the one person who deserved his redemption? The street was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the night breeze. A flickering street lamp cast uneven light over the pavement, where Marcus Bennett and Jason Turner stood near the entrance of a small convenience store. The old brick building had a worn-out sign, its edges curled from years of sun and rain. The glass door reflected their faces. Marcus's deep brown eyes filled with uncertainty, Jason's pale face set in determination. "This is the last time," Marcus said under his breath, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His hoodie was pulled up, shadowing his face, but his fingers twitched at his sides. Jason sucked in a breath, his fingers gripping the edge of his jacket pocket. "It's quick. No one gets hurt." His voice carried the same confidence he'd always had since they were kids, running through the alleyways of their area. The store clerk, an older man with thinning hair and a tired expression, barely looked up from his newspaper when they walked in. The place smelled of stale chips and cleaning detergent. A hum from the refrigerator filled the silence as Marcus glanced at Jason. This was their moment. Jason moved first, pulling a pistol from his pocket and raising it just enough to be seen. "Open the register," he ordered, his voice tight. The clerk's newspaper slipped from his hands, crumpling against the counter. His fingers fumbled and eyes wide with fear. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want trouble." Marcus stood still, his pulse drumming in his ears. He didn't want to be here. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. "Now," Jason snapped. The old man moved too fast, his hand darting under the counter. A loud pop rang out, sharp and deafening in the small store. Marcus flinched. The clerk staggered back, gripping his shoulder. Red bloomed across his shirt. His eyes darted between the two young men, pain and terror battling in his expression. Marcus's breath hitched. "What did you do?" "I didn't shoot him. He had a gun." Jason's hands trembled as he pointed toward the counter, where a small revolver had slipped to the floor. The clerk's chest heaved as he slumped against the shelves, knocking over a row of snack bags. "We need to go." Marcus grabbed Jason's arm, his stomach in knots. Before they could move, red and blue lights painted the store in flashing streaks. Tires screeched outside. "Police. Hands where we can see them." Marcus's arm shot up instinctively, his stomach twisting. Jason hesitated, but followed, his gun clattering to the floor. The front door burst open, and officers stormed in, their weapons raised. Cold metal snapped around Marcus's wrists before he could even process what was happening. Jason protested, his voice high and panicked. "We didn't shoot him." The officers weren't listening. Marcus's head was forced down as they pushed him toward the squad car. The sirens wailed as they were shoved inside, the city streets blurring past. Marcus barely heard Jason talking beside him. His mind was stuck on the store clerk's face, twisted in pain, his blood pooling on the tile floor. By the time they reached the station, reality settled in like a heavy weight. Inside the holding room, the walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and something stale. A metal table sat in the center, 2 chairs on either side. Marcus and Jason were separated, each led into different rooms. A tall officer leaned against the doorway, flipping through a folder. His eyes barely glanced up as he spoke. "Attempted murder and robbery. Serious charges." Marcus's throat tightened. "We didn't shoot him." The officer shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You were there. You had a gun." Marcus opened his mouth, but the words stuck. No one was going to listen. They had already decided his fate. Later that night, Marcus sat in a cold cell, his hands clenched into fists. Jason was in the next cell over, his head bowed. Neither of them spoke. The next morning, they were led into a courtroom, their ankles shackled. The judge's bench stood high above them, polished wood gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A man with neatly combed silver hair adjusted his glasses and looked down at them. "Judge William Harrington," a voice announced. Marcus swallowed. He had heard the name before. Everyone had. A man with power. A man who made decisions that could change lives in an instant. And as the judge's eyes swept over them, Marcus felt something in his stomach sink. He already knew how this was going to end. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional shuffle of papers and the distant echo of footsteps in the hallway. Marcus sat at the defendant's table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his wrists sore from the tight metal. His court-appointed lawyer, a man who looked as if he had too many cases and too little time, flipped through a thin file, barely glancing at Marcus. Across the room, Jason sat with his private attorney, a tall man in an expensive suit, his tie perfectly straight. Jason's father, a businessman with graying hair and sharp eyes, sat in the front row, his arms crossed. The difference between the two sides of the courtroom was impossible to ignore. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Judge William Harrington entered. His presence alone carried weight, his neatly pressed robe draping over his shoulders as he took his seat. His sharp blue eyes swept over the courtroom before settling on Marcus and Jason. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the evidence. The grainy security footage played on a large screen. The image was unclear, the figures blurry, faces indistinct. The prosecutor, a man with slicked back hair and a crisp voice, pointed to the screen. "This footage shows both defendants inside the store during the robbery." The clerk was shot moments later. The video played again, the same unclear images flashing across the screen. Marcus shifted in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. They had no proof of who had pulled the trigger. No fingerprints, no witness accounts, just this footage. Jason's lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the jury. "This footage does not prove my client's involvement in any crime. He was present, yes, but presence is not participation." He turned toward Jason. "My client had no weapon. He did not act with intent. He was simply there." Marcus's lawyer barely reacted. He cleared his throat and flipped through his notes, standing awkwardly. "Your Honor, my client also did not fire a weapon. There is no evidence that." Judge Harrington raised a hand, silencing him. His attention shifted back to Jason's lawyer, nodding slightly. "Proceed." Jason's lawyer continued, explaining how Jason had never been in trouble before, how he had good grades, a steady job, how this was nothing more than a mistake, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marcus clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists beneath the table. He wanted to speak, to say something, but his lawyer hadn't told him to. He just sat there, waiting. The trial stretched on. Witnesses were called, police officers who had been on the scene, a forensic analyst who had examined the store, the doctor who treated the injured clerk. But nothing new was revealed. No one could say for certain who had fired the shot. The prosecution treated them as a single entity, both responsible, both guilty. When the time came for the judge's ruling, the tension in the courtroom was thick. Judge Harrington removed his glasses, setting them neatly on the bench. He looked first at Jason. "The court finds Jason Turner not guilty on all charges." A breath of relief came from Jason's side of the courtroom. His father nodded. His lawyer patted his shoulder. Jason himself barely reacted, just looking down at the table. Then the judge turned to Marcus. His expression hardened. "Marcus Bennett, you were found guilty of attempted murder and robbery. Given your history and the dangerous nature of this crime, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Marcus's body went rigid. His ears rang. He barely heard the gasps from the gallery, the sound of his mother's voice breaking into a sob somewhere behind him. Jason's lawyer packed his papers neatly. Jason didn't look at Marcus as he stood and walked out with his father. Marcus's lawyer sighed, running a hand over his forehead. "I'll file an appeal," he muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. The guards grabbed Marcus's arms, pulling him to his feet. The weight of the sentence crushed him as they led him away. The last thing he saw before leaving the courtroom was Judge Harrington, already moving on to the next case, as if Marcus's life had never mattered at all. The transport van rattled over uneven pavement, the cold metal bench beneath Marcus offering no comfort. His wrists and ankles were shackled, the restraints biting into his skin with each jolt. Across from him sat two other inmates, their faces unreadable in the dim light. The air smelled of sweat and old leather, the space too tight, too closed in. No one spoke. The drive stretched on, the city fading behind them. When the van finally stopped, the doors swung open, revealing high concrete walls topped with coils of razor wire. Iron gates slid apart with a mechanical groan, swallowing them into the facility. Guards waited in stiff uniforms, hands resting on their belts. The prisoners were herded out, their chains clinking with each step. Inside, the air was thick, a mixture of bleach and something stale. The walls, a dull shade of gray, seemed to close in the farther they walked. They were stripped of their belongings, issued standard orange jumpsuits, and led through a series of heavy steel doors, each one locking behind them with a sharp clang. Marcus kept his head down as they moved through the corridors. Inmates lined the walkways above, watching from behind thick bars. Some called out, others simply stared. The guard beside him barely reacted. He had done this too many times before. His cell was small, bare walls, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, and a metal toilet in the corner. No windows, just a small slit in the door. The bars slammed shut behind him. Time moved differently inside. Meals were handed through a slot, the food bland and unappealing. The guards patrolled in silence, their footsteps steady, unhurried. The lights buzzed overhead, never quite turning off, casting a dull glow that made it impossible to tell if it was day or night. In the yard, men stood in clusters, their conversations low, measured. Some lifted weights, others sat at metal tables, playing cards. Fights broke out sometimes, quick, brutal, but the guards never rushed to stop them. They let things play out until one man hit the ground. Marcus kept to himself. He didn't trust anyone. Days turned into weeks. The ache in his chest never faded. He thought about his mother, about the life he'd never get back. He thought about Jason, free, untouched by all of this. The anger built, but there was nowhere for it to go. He was trapped, boxed in by concrete and metal, by a system that had already decided his fate before he ever walked into that courtroom. One afternoon, as he sat in the yard, a shadow fell over him. A man, older, with tired eyes and deep scars along his arms, took a seat across from him. "You keep looking like that, and you won't last long," the man said, his voice rough. Marcus didn't respond. The man leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You can spend your time in here being angry, or you can figure out how to survive. That choice is yours." Marcus stared at the cracked pavement beneath his feet, his hands curling into fists. Meanwhile, the past crept in like a slow-moving tide, pulling William Harrington back to a time he had long buried. Years ago, before the prestige of the courtroom and the weight of the gavel, he had been a young law student with ambition burning in his chest. It was then that he met Teresa, sharp-witted, full of life, and utterly unlike anyone he had ever known. Their relationship had been a secret, concealed beneath whispers and hidden meetings. He had convinced himself it was for the best. Society wasn't kind to a man like him, with a black woman by his side. He told himself he loved her, that what they had was real, but when she told him she was pregnant, the future he had planned cracked beneath the weight of reality. He had been terrified. A child would destroy everything. His career, his reputation, the path he had meticulously carved for himself. He tried to reason with her, to tell her it wasn't the right time, that they weren't ready. But Teresa refused to hide. She refused to be ashamed of their child. So he left. He severed every tie, married a woman who fit the image he needed, and built the life he had envisioned. He never looked back, never reached out, never acknowledged the boy she raised alone. Marcus. The name had been just that, a name, until it appeared in his courtroom, connected to a case that should have been straightforward. But the moment he saw Marcus, something inside him stilled. The resemblance was undeniable. He had dismissed it at first, convincing himself it was coincidence, a trick of the mind. But when he learned Teresa's full name, the truth became inescapable. His son. He had sentenced his own blood to life in prison. In the cold cell, Marcus sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the wall. The concrete was unyielding, just like everything else in his life. His hands clenched into fists, his thoughts looping over the revelation like a broken record. Judge Harrington was his father. His mother had never spoken about the man who abandoned them. She had never uttered a name, never allowed resentment to take root in their home. But now Marcus saw it all so clearly. The way she had always worked twice as hard, the exhaustion in her eyes, the love she had poured into him without ever speaking of the man who left. And that man had sat on his bench, looking down at him, deciding his fate as if he were nothing more than another case file. He hadn't hesitated. He hadn't even flinched. A storm of emotions raged inside him. Anger, betrayal, an ache he didn't want to name. Did he hate the judge who had condemned him? Or did he hate the father who had abandoned him? Were they even separate? The walls pressed in closer. The sounds of prison life carried through the bars. Men arguing, laughter that held no warmth, the distant clank of a metal door shutting somewhere down the hall. He had spent his life fighting to prove he was more than the circumstances he was born into. And yet, here he was, sentenced before he had even spoken a word in his own defense. He wanted to scream, to tear through the concrete and steel, to demand an answer from the man who had ruined him. But there would be no answers. There would be no justice. Just the four walls around him, closing in tighter with each breath. The street was quiet as Teresa stepped out of the cab, her fingers curling into the strap of her purse. The house in front of her was exactly as she remembered. Tall, pristine, untouched by time. She had stood on this doorstep once before, years ago, with a different heart, a different purpose. She rang the doorbell. The chime rang out, sharp and clear. A few moments passed before the door opened, revealing Judge William Harrington. His expression, once impassive, tense when he saw her standing there. Teresa. His voice held no warmth, just recognition. She took a step forward. You sentenced your own son. Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't know. Harrington's grip tightened on the doorframe. I was doing my job. Your job. She let out a breath, steadying herself. You looked at him, you listened to him, and you still didn't see? Or did you just not care? Her voice rose, years of anger pressing against her chest. You left me. You left him. And now you've destroyed his life. His jaw twitched, but his expression stayed firm. That boy, Marcus, he made his choices. That boy's your son. Teresa's voice cracked. Your blood. You abandoned him once, and now you've locked him away like he's nothing to you. How do you live with yourself? Harrington straightened, his face unreadable. We're done here. Teresa swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. You don't even deserve to say his name. She turned away, the cold air hitting her as she walked back toward the cab, leaving him standing in the doorway. Days later, in the sterile prison meeting room, Marcus sat across from the man he once only knew as the judge who sentenced him. The thick glass between them reflected back two faces, similar in ways that neither could deny. Harrington picked up the receiver, his fingers pressing into the plastic. You wanted this meeting, he said, his voice measured. Why? Marcus studied him. Because I need to know. Did you really not recognize me? Or did you just not care? A pause. It wouldn't have changed anything. Marcus let out a short breath through his nose. You looked right at me and called me a criminal. You told that courtroom I was nothing. And the whole time, you knew. Harrington's fingers tightened around the receiver. I did what was necessary. No. Marcus shook his head. You did what was easy. Harrington's face remained rigid. But for the first time, Marcus saw something crack beneath the surface. A flicker of something unsettled. A realization, maybe, but it wasn't enough. You're just like all the others, Harrington said, his voice quieter now. Men like you end up here. It was only a matter of time. Marcus stared at him, his grip on the receiver steady. You decided that for me before I even had a chance. But you don't get to define me. Not anymore. Harrington said nothing. The silence stretched between them until the guards signaled the end of the visit. Marcus placed the receiver down first, pushing to his feet. He didn't look back as he walked away. Harrington sat at his desk, the weight of the past pressing down on him. His focus wavered in court. Simple rulings became difficult. The eyes of other judges lingered longer than before, their silent scrutiny unsettling. He had been untouchable once. Now, his decisions were being questioned. The cracks were showing. Meanwhile, Marcus refused to let his father's verdict be his end. He spent hours in the prison library, poring over case files, searching for any avenue to appeal. His future wasn't set in stone. He would fight for it, no matter what it took. Teresa, though shattered, found something close to peace. She had faced the man who had erased her and her son from his life. She had spoken the truth, and for the first time in years, she felt lighter. Late one evening, Harrington stood before his bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection. The face looking back at him was not the same man who had once been certain of his own righteousness. His own eyes betrayed him, reminding him of Marcus, of choices made, of a past that could no longer be ignored. And for the first time, the silence in his house felt suffocating.